something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, and the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today our guest is Max Parry, and he is here to speak with us about his new Covert Action magazine article entitled, "Did the CIA Covertly Support Chechen Separatist Terrorism?" Of course they did. Max Parry is an independent journalist and geopolitical analyst based in Baltimore. His writing has appeared widely in alternative media, and he is a frequent political commentator featured in Sputnik News and Press TV. He also hosts the podcast Captive Minds. Check out the show notes for links. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. Today's episode is free, but if you appreciate serious, deep political research and analysis, consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. We have over 200 episodes and counting for people who want to better understand things like the JFK assassination, as well as other aspects of the deep history of the U.S. empire. American Exception is the place to go. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Subscribe if you can, and either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to this American Exception channel. Max Parry, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. It's great to be with you. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk.
Yeah, well, we're happy to have you here, and you've recently written an article for Covert Action magazine, and the article is entitled, "Did the CIA Covertly Support Chechen Separatist Terrorism?" Of course they did, and this is something that is, this is such an important but overlooked part of history. And Chechnya is kind of, it's not the very beginning of the whole operation of the, McJihad era of the 1990s. I think that you could place that at Azerbaijan, but Chechnya is right there, and it's all part of that whole plan that was put into play to try to basically destabilize Russia and take over that area of the world and make it safe for U.S. Global dominance.
Mm-hmm.
So why did you, for your purposes, for our purposes, why did you go and write this article on Chechnya now? Did you learn anything new about this recently, or did you just decide that it was something that was important that needed to be fleshed out more?
The reason that I chose to write this now, I have written about Chechnya before, but I actually did learn a great deal more than any other of any of the other articles I've written before about the subject, because it's just such a deep rabbit hole. I mean, I really could have written an entire book about this, and in fact, the article got so long that when I initially submitted it, I had to split it into two parts because it was like more than 11,000 words or something. So I ended up separating it into two parts, where this first part is more about the terrorism itself and the covert support for that. And then the second article, which is forthcoming, is more about specifically the role of the nonprofit industrial complex, or the humanitarian aid agencies' sort of role in it, in the wake of the USAID scandal with the Trump administration. But this first article is more about the support for the actual terrorism, and what prompted it was, in December, when the Syrian government fell in Damascus to these rebranded jihadists, it was very shocking, obviously, to anyone who's followed that conflict for a number of years now, because many people were under the impression that that Assad had won and the war was over. So this rapid fall was quite stunning, and I noticed that people were really debating the comments that Putin made after, where he was, basically downplaying the idea that, I mean, I know a lot of people say behind the scenes there was like a deal negotiated where Assad was sacrificed in exchange for some sort of peace treaty in Ukraine. I don't know whether I necessarily believe that, but it's certainly possible. But either way, Putin was really downplaying the idea that the ouster of Assad was this big setback for Moscow or a big strategic defeat. And so I just started looking into why he might be saying that. And then, I had written about the Chechen conflict before. And, the thing about Putin is, like, in the West, he's always portrayed as this, like, ideologue or like extreme
arch villain, really. He's the evil mastermind or something.
But if
he's he's not smart enough to be a mastermind. He's just evil, and he uses the Russian playbook.
Yeah, I mean, and anyone
stupid.
Anyone who actually knows anything about him, he is maddeningly, reasonable, and like, I mean, you watch the Oliver Stone interviews with him. The whole time Oliver Stone is trying to get him to say a bad word about the United States, and he like won't do it. Everything about Putin is so reserved and controlled, and very careful what he says. And so, the way that he was able to resolve the Chechen conflict was because he was able to reach a political compromise with the actual, so-called moderates or nationalists within that movement, and namely the Kadyrovs, who had defected back to the Russian side as the uprising became increasingly Wahhabized. Even though, I mean, people forget that Ahmed Kadyrov, I think he was the one who made this infamous quote about, when he was still part of the Chechen independence movement, that I think he said something like, there are 150 million Russians and there's 1 million Chechens or something like that. So if every Chechen kills 150 Russians, we'll win the war or something like that. I mean, the Kadyrovs were at one point, they were part of this insurgency. And
let's for people who are not steeped in the history, and I've written about these subjects, and done podcasts on them, but once you get into these Central Asian, Russian, Eastern European names, they do not stick in my head. So let's talk about the main actors here. Who was the main jihadi, like the main, let's say, spooky jihadi figure of the Chechens?
Well, his name was Shamil Basayev. He was the leader of the most radical faction, and he worked directly with Ibn al-Khattab, who was a Saudi Jordanian foreign fighter who was basically like the official representative of Al-Qaeda in the region. And they had met previously in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And, but Shamil Basayev was the leader of the most radical jihadist wing of the Chechen independence movement. And in addition to launching an insurgency, I talk about this in the article, there was a very, very thin line between the so-called moderates and the jihadists, because they formed a coalition government. And, even it was called the Republic of Ichkeria, which was the Chechen separatist government there. It actually, despite being led by a purported moderate, it had a very strict interpretation of Sharia law. There were public executions and beheadings, including even of Western individuals. Like, there was a big incident in the late 90s where these four, I believe they were from New Zealand and the UK, they were there as contractors for like a telecom company, and they were abducted and beheaded, basically. Some people say that bin Laden was even involved in giving the order for that. But it was in the late 90s. Chechnya was a very dangerous place, and there was a slave markets and kidnappings, and it had a very strict interpretation of Sharia law, so much so that I believe the Taliban was like the only government in the world to recognize them, even though we were supposed to believe that it was led by people who were purely fighting for nationalist independence, and it wasn't about jihad. And I think it's the kind of thing where the so-called nationalists were using the Islamists and vice versa. Like one was using the other for muscle and for fighting force, and then the Islamists were using the moderates for like political legitimacy and cover.
Right.
But yeah, it was.
And the guy that's on the other side now, or the family, because it's the son now, but it's Kadyrov, or how do you say the name?
Ramzan Kadyrov. Yeah, he was originally part of the Chechen independence movement, like his father, who was the chief mufti of the Republic of Ichkeria, which existed from 96 to 99. As Basayev really took over things and the place became increasingly lawless and overrun with terrorism, eventually Putin was able to strike a deal with the elder Kadyrov, who, as I mentioned before, made some statements that were pretty, he was a militant, but even he was, Chechens are historically practitioners of a mystical form of Islam called Sufism, and they, Wahhabism was something that was imported into the conflict by, the Saudis played an instrumental role, and like I said, Al Qaeda had this official member there, Ibn al-Khattab, who brought with him his foreign fighters to fight on the Chechen side. And so the movement, the initial Chechen war in the mid 90s, when Yeltsin was president, was, arguably much more a war for nationalist independence. But, even within that wave of the movement, there was Islamists very much involved in that. And, if, like, for example, the initial...
What were the years of the first Chechen War?
It was like 94 to 96.
Yeah, that's right. 94
And
96. So the Republic of Ichkeria, those years overlap. Is that correct?
Well, the Republic of Ichkeria was formed after they reached a ceasefire. Basically, what happened was...
Okay. So what years was the Republic of Ichkeria again?
96 to 99.
96 to 99. Okay. Yeah, because when I'm looking at this, the Chechen part of it starts, the first Chechen War is in 1994, and this is the decision, in 1991 to go into the Middle East and basically continue the sort of mujahideen and repurpose it. They staged that coup in Azerbaijan in 1991.
Yeah.
And it's a Western-backed thing, mega oil. Maybe it's British. People have thought that it was British intelligence, perhaps. But it's also interesting that in the same time, there's this mega group in the U.S., which happens to be a bunch of super Israel deep state, oligarchs and whatever, this like body of like people who are gonna sort of, plan Israel lobby activities and interface with Mossad or something like that, right? And it included Les Wexner was one of the people on there. So I've always wondered if that's just a coincidence or if it was a British thing. But either way, it involved a lot of. It was certainly Western, and the U.S. was a part of it, or U.S. actors were, because it involved people from Iran-Contra even, or Air America. Like Richard Secord was Air America and Iran-Contra, and in both cases he like sets up these, run these airlines, guns go one way, drugs go the other way. He did the same thing in Azerbaijan with mega oil, and they eventually have a coup, and using these Islamists, and it overthrows the government there, and it moves the Azerbaijan, which is really crucial for Caspian oil, it moves them over basically to the western side, and people like Dick Cheney join the Chamber of Commerce
Yes.
there, and the Azerbaijan Chamber of Commerce, and it really becomes like this sort of neocon beachhead, and they use it for jihadi operations. And so this fits in. This is a part of that history. This is the Chechen War isn't the first of these post Afghanistan Mujahideen McJihad operations, whatever we want to call them, but it flowed out of that, and it was sort of a stepping stone, because once they go into Chechnya, then they're doing these similar things in using jihadis in Bosnia and in
Yes.
Kosovo, and it's like a pipeline, drug line, weapon, rat line, like everything is. And Chechnya was a big part of their plans here.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned Azerbaijan, because yes, that plays a huge role. I mean, I know that during the 1990s, Dick Cheney, when he was CEO of Halliburton, he also lobbied Congress to end the sanctions against Azerbaijan that were imposed, I believe, in 1992. Because it had a blockade over Armenia, which was landlocked, and Cheney argued that removing the sanctions and backing the, I mean, this is earlier when he was defense secretary, but backing the sale of Halliburton pipeline equipment to the Azeris was a way of undermining Russia and advancing U.S. interests. And even though this is while the Azeris are conducting pogroms and ethnically cleansing Armenians, that's very, not unlike what the Turks did to the Armenians in World War One. Nevertheless, those sanctions were lifted because, like these other people you're mentioning, who, a lot of them were carryovers from Iran-Contra. I mean, a lot of the people on the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya were implicated in Iran-Contra. Their only interest was oil. And I think Cheney gave like a speech to the Azerbaijan Chamber of Commerce that saying that banning U.S. assistance to the Azeris was a misguided policy, and that the Caspian Sea was this vital oil province that we're in the middle of this global competition with Russia, which was just emerging, and we have to start maneuvering in basically a new great game for influence over the Caspian Sea basin and its vast oil and gas reserves. That you mentioned Azerbaijan. I mean, in that conflict, that's where Shamil Basayev met Ibn al-Khattab, and he later ended up joining the insurgency. And doing research for this, I watched a press conference with Leoma Usmanov, who was like one of the representatives to the U.S. of the Ichkerian government. And he's in a suit, so it's very moderate looking, and he was actually sponsored. His stay in the U.S. was sponsored by Zbigniew Brzezinski, I know. And I watched this like hour-long press conference with him in late 1999, just as the movement was becoming really Wahhabist, and Russia was making all kinds of accusations about the fact that the blatantly obvious al-Qaeda presence in the Caucasus. And these Western journalists are asking him, Russia's saying that you have members of al-Qaeda on your territory. And this is when bin Laden was ostensibly being pursued for the bombings in Kenya and Tanzania the year before. I think it's still, it was prior to USS Cole, but he had the embassy bombings had occurred. So bin Laden was at large, and these Western journalists are asking this Ichkerian government representative, and he goes, "Oh no, we don't have any. Well, we have one al-Qaeda member on our territory, just one. This guy Khattab." And so the journalist follows up with him, is like, "Why don't you arrest this guy? If he's on your territory, if you're not in bed with Islamists, why don't you apprehend him and hand him over to Russian authorities?" And he goes on to admit, well, there are certain people within our government he's clearly referring to Basayev and his ilk, that they're here, but he's here by invitation, and he has their sanction, and he's a guest of them. And so, he was admitting basically in this press conference that they were deliberately harboring elements of Al-Qaeda. So it's not like this was any secret to the mainstream media. This is very much out in the open. But no, the whole Caucasus region is oil rich. It's adjacent to the Caspian Sea, and Dick Cheney gave he made a speech to just as there was the Chechen war was going on. He made this speech where he's talking about how the Caspian region has never been, there's never been a greater opportunity for the U.S. hegemon to the strategic significance of the Caspian was emerging in a way that he that was unsurpassed, and just millions of dollars in revenue, billions of dollars in revenue to be had from that.
It didn't end up panning out that way, though, as I understand that they actually didn't. The discoveries of oil were less. I mean, were less than was being bandied about at that time. It didn't quite pan out the way that they'd planned as far as the oil goes. But there also were other things that they intertwined there with the drugs. I mean, the drug pipelines. That's a huge part of the whole. I mean, that's when Al Qaeda is there in Chechnya. The way that I read that is that they are likely involved in financing these guys, because I do not believe that people become jihadis like this and are willing to take these things on without some kind of external support, generally speaking. I mean, it's hard to get people to fight and die and be this fanatical about something without this external support. And the Al-Qaeda networks were used to trap. I mean, they were drug trafficking networks. I mean, you mentioned Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. He factors in to some of these people. I mean, it really is this same sort of outfit that was in place in Afghanistan and really profiting. I mean, it was the most absurd thing in the 1980s. Reagan declares war on drugs. We have all this propaganda when we're growing up of like, just say no, kids, just say no to drugs. That'll solve the drug problem. But the biggest, all the cocaine cartels are his allies, and they're working with the Contras. Are protected by the CIA, and the heroin is in Afghanistan, and that's also intertwined with the U.S. government. And the Reagan's own DEA people are not really allowed to go after top drug dealers, because this has been a big part of the U.S. economy really since the end of World War II. In fact, if there's any area where the West has had a monopoly on Western countries in the U.S. and its intelligence friendly allies have had a monopoly, it's on the drug trade. When you stop and look at it, it's always denominated in dollars. It always flows back into the Western financial system, and it's typically run in a way that's tolerated by law enforcement. That ends up being the key of like what makes these different drug trafficking networks survive, is who has the fix, who is able to avoid prosecution from the authorities. And for decades after World War II, it was Meyer Lansky, and we don't know. It changes over time. It seems like it's Trafficante is the main, sort of replaces Lansky until around the Iran-Contra era, which is an interesting issue of timing. And now we don't really know. But when I see those guys in there, I'm thinking that that's likely a big part of the financing there. So you can see why the media will not go there, because it doesn't deal just with jihadi terrorists and Al-Qaeda, which is big enough, but it also points back, if you look at it very deeply, to the drug traffic and the sort of national secret that's not really so secret, that the drug trade has been an element of the empire.
Well, they won't even talk about it in the context of, the war in Afghanistan after 9/11. I mean, look at the way that under the NATO occupation, that country just became a narco state. And, the Karzai government, his brother, that family, I mean, these puppet leaders, I mean, the whole time, that it's under U.S. occupation, even though it was the Taliban, actually, of all people, had issued a successful fatwa, banning, the opium trade, and it just blooms when we're supposedly waging this huge, counter narcotics operation with a huge budget, and yet it just continues to increase. And, just it was so obvious that we were, it was lining the pockets of the people that we had propped up there after 9/11. And then lo and behold, the Taliban are back in power now, and they've issued another fatwa and banned opium production, and it's gone down again. So it's like the Taliban are able to successfully implement a ban on this, and yet we have this 20-year occupation where we're spending an absolutely incalculable amount of money on counter narcotics, and the industry just continues to thrive. And then, clearly we have, I've written about this before. We've had not coincidentally, a huge opioid epidemic in the United States. Yes, a lot of that is related to synthetic opioids, but
that may be why the change to synthetic, the power of synthetics now might be the reason why Afghanistan was ultimately, mothballed. The whole operation, they just were like, okay, we give up, or we're gonna. Because I think that you wonder why were we there for so long? What did we really get out of it? And people are like, oh, it's the military-industrial complex. They just want to stay there forever, and I'm sure that's an element of it. But the narco economy is huge. It's one of the top 3 internationally traded commodities. There's oil, weapons, and drugs, illegal drugs. So, and we were occupying the main place, the main producer of heroin. And then we have a long history of benefiting from the drug trade. So it's so sordid and kind of obvious to an extent.
Yeah, and Chechnya, like you were saying about the Balkans as well, which was a notoriously caught up in the pipeline, the pipeline of narco trafficking, with especially in Kosovo with the Kosovo Liberation Army. The same thing was going on in Chechnya, really, because Chechnya, during the period of the Ichkerian government, was a totally lawless region, overrun with banditry and the Chechen mafia. And there was all kinds of drug trafficking going on, the drug trade through there. And it was absolute mayhem. And that's the state that we were supporting and portraying as, as it was Russia that was the one violating human rights. And yes, during the first Chechen war, the bombing campaign by Russia, which actually had the backing of the United States, was very, very brutal, and tens of thousands of Chechens did die. But as the conflict became increasingly, after there was basically in the mid 90s, there was a hostage taking at a hospital in Stavropol, where several thousand people were taken hostage, and they had mines in the place, and Basayev was threatening to kill them all. A peace treaty was reached, and the Chechens withdrew, and that brought an end to the first Chechen war, and they were able to set up this mini republic, this quasi-state, and it was, a coalition government made up of Islamists and nationalists, and it was totally overrun, not just with narco trafficking, but with terrorism. And during that period, the Wahhabist influence really took over. And that absolutely plays into, U.S. imperialism's facilitation of the drug trade. And then when Putin came to power, that conflict, I believe, was supposed to continue indefinitely. And they were very mistrustful of him, because I don't think it's a coincidence that right as he made this rapid ascendancy to power, that's when you have people like Brzezinski and all these neocons formed the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya, which is this NGO set up in 1999. And if you look at its roster, it's the overlap with PNAC, the Project for the New American Century, and then even also the overlap with what was it, the American Committee for Iraq, the neocons that really drove the lead up to the war in Iraq. It's a lot of the same figures, and that I believe that there was a real shift because even before Putin came to power, in the last days of Yeltsin's presidency, he had fallen out of favor. He had criticized the NATO bombing of Serbia, and there was a lot of political pressure on him because the Russians were very upset about the fact that the U.S., under Clinton in the last year had acceded 3 more countries to NATO. So there was the NATO expansion factor. And then Putin maneuvered his way into Yeltsin's inner circle, and the next year became president. But I think from the very beginning, there was, he was targeted for, as somebody that they could not trust. And that's when I think, this real shift where, I believe that the support for the Chechens covertly began earlier. And that's sort of what my second article is about, because in the mid 90s, while at least outwardly Clinton was backing Yeltsin and their war in Chechnya, there was a Soros Foundation contractor who was I believe, an intelligence operative, and a lot of people believe he was an intelligence operative. His name was Fred Cuny. His official cover was that he was a humanitarian aid specialist. He had done operations during the Gulf War, like moving the Kurds to safety to basically set up the autonomous zone they have there in Iraqi Kurdistan. And then after that, he had done operations in Bosnia, with the water irrigation system in Sarajevo, working for the Soros Foundation and I believe also the CIA. But then he moved to Chechnya at a time where it was so besieged by Russian forces. It was so dangerous, the bombing campaign, that no other humanitarian aid groups would go in there. And he went there. This was in 1995. And he was meeting with the Chechen rebel leaders at the time, not just the moderates, but also he met with Basayev. And he was mysteriously killed. He was actually a huge proponent of the Chechens. He was trying to lobby he had taken out op-eds in newspapers, criticizing
the Cuny guy or Soros?
Fred Cuny.
Okay.
But he was working for Soros. He was sent there by him. And he had taken out op-eds like in newspapers criticizing Russia's bombing. And this was at a time where Russia was still at least ostensibly being supported by the U.S. And then he ends up getting whacked by the separatists, even though he was supporting them, because supposedly there was nuclear blackmail going on where, during the fall of the Soviet Union, the nuclear arms in the near abroad states were supposed to have returned all their nukes to Russia after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. But the collapse of the Soviet Union was so chaotic that there was a lot of rumors that there was like loose nukes out there. And apparently this was believable enough to where the Russians and the U.S. was suspicious that the Chechens were in possession of a nuke. And there was also in Chechnya like a Soviet military installation. And so there was a fear that they could use a nuke, which is sort of one of the main reasons that Chechnya, the Russians, despite the fact that they were mercilessly bombing Chechnya, they had not gone all in in an offensive to Grozny, like Putin later did in the Second Chechen War, was because this threat. And so basically the story is that Cuny, while he was there, found out that the Chechens were bluffing and that the Chechens didn't want this to get out. They didn't even want the Americans to know. And then he ends up getting whacked by the separatists. And so that's sort of what my second article is about. But I believe that he was actually smuggling arms. There was even a Hollywood movie with Angelina Jolie. It's called Beyond Borders. That's very clearly loosely based on Fred Cuny, like the man that her character falls in love with. And in that movie,
so he's a hero. He's a good guy, basically. Is that
yeah? Even though in that movie he's basically like the part in Cambodia, he's smuggling arms and humanitarian aid shipments, presumably to the Khmer Rouge, who were known to be supported by the CIA. So basic, but even this guy's own family, Fred Cuny, there was like a PBS documentary made about him in a book by a New York Times journalist named Scott Anderson, it's worth reading. It's called The Man Who Tried to Save the World. It's all of his family and people in the humanitarian aid community. They all thought he was an intelligence operative because he was like constantly crossing the line.
Yeah.
Between, because you're supposed to be impartial, presumably, even though
he's a political actor.
Yeah, it was very obvious. I mean, if you're a humanitarian aid specialist, and you're trying to bring aid to a region, you don't take op-eds in a newspaper criticizing one side and like whitewashing another.
Well, and the game there seems very dirty because he's an intelligence operative. The U.S. is supposedly against jihadi terror. The U.S. Russia is an ally of the U.S. on paper.
Well,
they're supporting them, they're supporting Russia supposedly, but then also having their networks of jihadis behind this war in Chechnya, and then having humanitarian spooky people, liberal intervention, really dirty individuals out there, attacking Russia, which Russia is the target here. It seems pretty clear. Like ultimately the target is to make sure that Russia is not able to have stability and hegemony over their near abroad.
Yeah. And, he had actually, he's a very sketchy guy. Like when he was in Bosnia, he was there on the purported basis that he was helping, Sarajevo, which was under siege, like have a water irrigation system. But while he was there at the same time, he was lobbying for NATO to attack Serbia or the Republika Srpska, the Bosnian Serbs. And in fact, like during one of the massacres of like these supermarkets in Sarajevo, even though like the UN investigators originally determined that the Bosnians had most likely committed a false flag where they had killed their own people and were trying to blame it on the Serbs, he like mysteriously appears on the scene, bringing Peter Jennings and ABC News like in a bulletproof vest in tow. And gives this interview right on the scene of this massacre saying, oh, no, I saw it came from Republika Srpska territory. It was the Serbs that did this. And then shortly thereafter, NATO starts shooting down Bosnian Serb jets. So this guy is
it's just like the white helmets kind of a thing, this humanitarian person. But like, for all he had coordinated these things with the people that did the massacre, that would be, when you look at what the white helmets were doing and the tactics they used in Syria, these weren't invented in Syria. These are things that they've been doing for a while. So that guy, he seems a lot like a Peter, a different type of a Peter Monsieur character, whatever the guy is. Who's the white helmets guy?
Yeah, and he got whacked too. Got whacked too mysteriously in Turkey.
Yeah, some people wondered if his wife was the one that killed him or what exactly, but I don't know. I couldn't say, but I don't think it was natural causes or an accident.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm surprised more people don't know about Fred Cuny, and I was shocked when I learned about him, and I, did as much research about him as I possibly could. Yeah, no, I believe that the support for the Chechens started even earlier, possibly, yeah, where it was the kind of thing where the U.S. was outwardly backing Yeltsin, but then at the same time, there were elements, at least, or the intelligence community was supporting the insurgency. Um,
Yeah.
but certainly later on, it's undeniable that they were supporting them, especially as the movement became increasingly Wahhabist and was overrun by jihadists. I mean, but yeah, I believe even it might have began even earlier, and I think it could have started when this guy Fred Cuny showed up in Chechnya, when no other so-called humanitarian workers were even daring to go in there, when it was, I mean, just look at the pictures of Grozny, like in the mid 90s. It's like, it looks like almost like Gaza now.
Yeah.
They leveled the place to the ground. And of course, it's just like all this stuff is very neglected history. So that's why I really wanted to get into it. And
Yeah, and it gets mentioned, as you say. Putin mentions it in the interviews with Oliver Stone, and
yeah,
those interviews, as Putin seems more coherent and in command of the facts of politics and history that are relevant to the discussion, more so than any American statesman I can recall listening to lately. And I think that the reason is, in his position, while he's being interviewed by Stone, he mostly can tell the truth, because you just have to tell the truth about what the U.S. In his position, he needs to just speak candidly about the position of Russia vis-a-vis U.S. policies, and those are not. Those are so damning to the U.S. And he's a realist. He understands the war, how brutal it is. His family's experience in World War II. I
yeah,
mean, he's a cold realist, and a nationalist, who was, I think, dedicated to saving Russia from the terrible position that it was in. If you just look at the trends in Russia demographically and everything else, he's improved living standards and kept the U.S. from being able to further damage Russia like they did by affecting the end of the Soviet Union and then plundering the country with economic warfare and shock therapy. And this is the history that a lot of the people the institutional left in the U.S. is just, if you get institutional support, I think that you are corrupted by the U.S. empire in some way. You're only getting money because your perspective is useful to the U.S., to the empire. I believe this. And so that's why I believe they don't cover things like what we're talking about, like the white helmets, for example. Look at
mm-hmm.
how bad, like Democracy Now,
Oh, God.
Jacobin, The Nation, anybody with a budget who can actually hire people, any organization is going to get it, they can't deal with this, because I think the job of these supposedly liberal left, even I think Jacobin thinks that pretends to be radical, but the
Yeah,
reason that they exist and the reason they have money, I think, is to run interference for the shadiest things that the US does. And a lot of that comes on the clandestine side of things, because it's the clandestine side that has to create the humanitarian lie to justify these wars and these interventions and such. And so that is the part that the left that gets paid. What they get paid to do is to really launder this, to like launder the blood money, that it could be said to characterize the entire operation. The whole grand strategy of the U.S., which is to just crush every in every country that might possibly stand up to them, or that might stand up to the idea of a new American century, which they wanted to last forever. And we can't deal with it. This is why we can't really get a consensus, even on the so-called left, about opposing these horrific uh, policies that they recycle over and over again.
yeah. I mean, people refuse to connect the dots. I mean, even with something like what's going on right now in Gaza, like to have, it was so disappointing. Like after the Syrian government fell, and you had all these people I observed who had been opposing the genocide in Gaza, seemingly cheering on, the fall of Assad. And now you have the new Syrian regime basically indicating that they're willing to join the Abraham Accords and
It's so obvious now,
ties with Israel. I mean, it's just like the refusal to, these protests that have been happening on U.S. college campuses, which obviously are a good thing in some respects, like against the genocide. There is no broader movement against American imperialism or U.S. wars in general. It's being treated like an isolated thing. And obviously what's taking place in Gaza does.
It's a new level of just depravity, really.
I'm
It's
not trying to
unbelievable.
downplay the significance of it, but at the same time, it's
There's a
like,
context, and the context is even bigger than that. I mean, the people that have been died in Iraq and Syria, that's greater than Gaza, even though what's happening in Gaza is horrific and beyond imagining, really. And yet it's been going on, even it's part of a bigger thing. It's been nonstop.
yeah, and Yemen too. I mean, the Saudi war on Yemen has been arguably almost as genocidal as what's taking place in Gaza, and there's been nothing said about that. Even recently, the Trump strikes on Yemen, there was no. I mean, it's certainly not in those ridiculous hands-off protests. I mean, which I believe were designed to like corral people away or pull people away from any kind of Gaza
bigger critique.
Yeah, I mean, those were so suspicious to me. But the humanitarian interventionists. I mean, it's funny because Fred Cuny, like he's mostly a forgotten figure, but you will see, like, for example, in Samantha Power's memoir,
she probably writes about sipping wine with him somewhere in a war zone or something.
She was a reporter at the time, and she met him. She was a reporter in, a propagandist, really, in Bosnia, and that's sort of like where she cut her teeth. And later, of course, she became like the spokeswoman for the responsibility to protect of American imperialism. But she really always cites Cuny as like a source of inspiration, and which I think is very telling. But so stay tuned for part two. But part one of my article, really focuses on how what took place in Chechnya was very much an extension of what took place with Operation Cyclone. Khattab had fought in Afghanistan in addition to Nagorno-Karabakh, and a lot of the foreign fighters that ended up volunteering to fight in Chechnya came from the Afghan conflict. And then even, I've even discovered stuff more recently, like the fact that, like a lot of the 9/11 hijackers that were, or alleged 9/11 hijackers that were part of the Hamburg cell, like Mohammed Atta, he wanted to fight in Chechnya, and then they ended up sending them to the U.S. instead. Even Ayman al-Zawahiri, he had, I don't know about Chechnya, but he had at least tried to set up base in Dagestan.
Yeah.
This was in 96. And, a lot of people try and say that it was very suspicious, like Russia apprehended him because he was using a fake name. They didn't know it was him. And then he was released. But basically, he was in the Caucasus trying to set up shop for Al-Qaeda. And while he was in Russian custody, who you want to believe is up to you, but they claimed they had no idea who he was and he was using a fake name. It actually turned out that there was like this Russian politician who was an Islamist who later ended up committing terrorist attacks, actually, in Dagestan, lobbied for, because Zawahiri was in the Caucasus under a fake name, and this politician came to their defense, he and his little group of cohorts, saying, oh no, they're here for an economic trip or something like that. And then they ended up getting released. But then later on, this politician ended up committing terrorist attacks. And actually, it's funny that there's a mosque in Dagestan that's named after that guy as like a jihadist hero. And supposedly Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, had attended that mosque. So it just like comes full circle.
Oh yeah. Let's talk about that because that is you have I'd looked into this in the past and remember and knew that Graham Fuller's an interesting character, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain how that ties into to Chechnya and the whole McJihad phenomenon in general? Because I'd heard Sibel Edmonds had made reference to him in the past, and she comes up in your story too. And she, she's recently back and doing a little bit of journalism again. But she had really said as she saw firsthand, she'd uncovered some of these networks really when working for the FBI as a translator, and
Yeah.
was foiled and basically fired when she tried to expose some of these things that were going on, which was essentially a kind of criminal entity operating overseas in a way that was it didn't seem to have official sanction, or it was run with elements of the U.S. national security state and sort of deep state political actors that we know of, but it's never explained to us what was authorized and exactly what these operations were. They involve all of these things we've been talking about: drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, supporting of jihadi networks all throughout the Caucasus and Central Asia and the Balkans.
Yeah.
And Graham Fuller is a key figure here. And so could you explain who he is and how he connects to the Boston Marathon bombing? Because it's a fascinating angle.
Yeah, it's very complicated. I'll do my best to explain, but basically, Graham Fuller is a lifelong CIA operative, going back to the 70s, and in fact, he was the CIA station chief in Kabul. Right before the Carter administration launched Operation Cyclone to arm the Mujahideen in a proxy war against the Soviet Union, and he later ended up. He was also implicated in the Iran-Contra scandal when he was CIA. He was a CIA official in the Reagan administration, and then later on, he quote unquote retired after a long career and started working for the RAND Corporation, which of course is a CIA contractor and funded by the Pentagon, as a policy analyst or policymaker. And while he was there, at the time he was actually publicly taking out op-eds talking about how we need to use Islamists to undermine Russia, just like we did the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. And coincidentally, this all came out later in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, which is, of course, presumably committed by
A very weird case. Very weird.
Very strange. Two Chechen American brothers. And there were
and the one who's alive is not a jihad. The government doesn't even say he's a jihadi in any way or part of any organization. He's just not allowed to talk to anyone. It's the most it seems the government seems so guilty by the way it handles that. But that's a digression. But it just kind of blows my mind that
there's even stuff about him that's crazy. I mean, like the fact that he had like a professor in college that helped him on a report about the Russian-Chechen conflict. This is when I guess he was living in Massachusetts or New Hampshire or something. And he wrote this paper, and this professor helped him with it. And this professor also just so happens to be who had written articles for the Jamestown Foundation, which was one of Brzezinski's think tanks, whitewashing the Chechen separatists.
Yeah.
I mean, just the amount of coincidences that surrounded that bombing. But one of the most staggering was the fact that the Tsarnaev brothers' uncle, immediately after the bombing happened, they were ambushing the family members, asking them, "Did you see any warning signs? Were these guys radicalized? Were they, did you see any signs?" And one of the people they interviewed was their uncle, this guy Ruslan Sarny. And after he was interviewed, journalists started looking into his background, and it turned out that he, not only was he married to Graham Fuller's daughter, Turkish American daughter, but lived in Graham Fuller's house back in the 90s. And while he lived there, he had formed an organization called the Congress for Chechen International Organizations, which was an NGO that had sent everything like Kevlar boots, mine resistant blast boots, uniforms, X-ray machines, all kinds of like military stuff, presumably arms for all we know. And that the Congress for Chechen International Organizations appeared in the court case of this other fake charity called the Benevolence International Foundation, which was a front company for Al Qaeda that was shut down by the Treasury Department.
Benevolence International.
After 9/11, yes, the innocuously named Benevolence International.
Which is a front for Al Qaeda, which is a front for Western imperialism.
Yeah. I mean, it's just shocking. And they had done transactions, Ruslan Sarni's NGO and Benevolence International, which was this group that when it was uncovered by the Department of the Treasury, it showed all the like Saudi businessmen that were bankrolling bin Laden. And so, in other words, Benevolence International was also sending arms for sure to the Bosnian Mujahideen, and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was involved in that. This was a global jihadist network. And Ruslan Sarni, the Sarnaya brothers' uncle, was doing this while he was living in Graham Fuller's house. It's just shocking because at that very same moment, Graham Fuller is taking out newspaper articles writing about how we need to do the very thing that this
Uncle Ruslan
family member is doing in his house. I mean, it's clear this is a direct line that can be traced from a CIA operative through a bin Laden-related financial scheme, this front for Al-Qaeda, to the Chechen separatists. And these were not moderates that were being supported, because there's people named in this document. This guy, Sheikh Fatih Shashani, who, if you look him up, he was a radical, in separate court cases, he was named as a radical jihadist preacher and militant. So there's no way that Sarni or Fuller can try and say, oh, this was going to moderates. It's clear that this was an operation to support jihad.
Why would it even go to, moderates to do what? Hold picket signs outside of the city hall? This is so ridiculous.
Yeah. There were so many bizarre coincidences around that bombing, but yeah, the Graham Fuller revelations were just one of them. And it's important to mention, you were talking about Sibel Edmonds earlier. Prior to the Boston Marathon bombing, she was a 9/11 whistleblower who courageously blew the whistle on numerous misconduct at the FBI.
Her story is her story is amazing, and it dovetails with work that I've done and that Peter Dale Scott has done, looking into these shadowy networks that traffic in, especially drugs and weapons flows, and using jihadis this way.
Yeah, she had. She was gagged by the state secrets privilege, not just for blowing the whistle on the FBI's foreknowledge of 9/11 and what they could have done to stop it, but also that in her translation work, she was privy to classified knowledge about what she describes as basically like an extension of Operation Gladio, where in the Caucasus and Central Asia, through madrasas and through the Gulen movement, who, by the way, Graham Fuller, Fethullah Gulen, the cleric in the Turkish cleric, Graham Fuller was one of the people who wrote a letter vouching for him so he could get safe harbor in the United States after he fled Turkey. But it was through his movement, and along with other
Turkish... they have a charter school like empire in the U.S. just to get a sense of how mobbed up all of this is. Graham Fuller or it's not Graham Fuller, Fethullah Gulen is a kid, like a oligarch of when it comes to these charter schools and all the money that they've made from them, like, and that is absolutely playing on government connections, spooky CIA connections, and
Yeah,
etc.
he's a known CIA asset,
And
and
according to Sibel, he was involved in the heroin trade too. Like all of these people were beneficiaries of the heroin trade as well. So this is really unbelievable.
yeah, and she had tried to blow the whistle about this. That this is the reason I'm being gagged, is because they don't want me to all this stuff to get out in court about what the CIA and NATO are doing in the Caucasus and Central Asia. And she even says on record, I quote her in the article, that we were intimately involved in all these operations, not just with the Chechen separatists against Russia, but the terrorism and Islamist jihad that went on in Xinjiang in China with the Uyghur.
Which is so obviously, that's one of the things that, we've talked about this on the podcast, but hardly anybody ever really even discusses it, is it's pretty obvious that the U.S. was involved in these uprisings. It's totally fits their playbook. People have tried to have a kind of limited hangout take on this, which is to say, oh, well, it's because the Chinese helped them and they helped with the Afghanistan Mujahideen. And so therefore, it's blowback. But that, if you know anything about the way the U.S. operates, and the fact that they're trying to make such a big issue and they're even making up genocide accusations, it was so obviously. And she's one of the few people to speak about this with some sort of insider knowledge, because there's not that much that's come out about it specifically about the operation. So that's another reason why I'd really like to talk to her about this. But it's all part of the same gangster scheme they had going.
Yeah, well, I hope she starts doing more media appearances again. I know she's got a Patreon now, and she's starting to do podcasts with fellow whistleblowers in that community. But yeah, her story really needs to be told, and that's why in my article I couldn't have done this subject without including her work in it, because she had, she corroborates a lot of what is widely believed about what was really going on. And it took something like the Boston Marathon bombing to like really reveal like some of the smoking gun evidence. I think that's really the closest thing to where you can really identify, like in court documents, this is where this was going on. Because Ruslan Sarni's company, he was living in Fuller's home. I mean, yeah, it's not as clear as like something like Timber Sycamore or Operation Cyclone, in that we know.
Yeah, they've never admitted really what the operation was and who was running it. It's just out there, it's out there. But including the fact that she had said, and that there was a Sunday Times article that was about to run until the State Department apparently squashed it, the U.S. State Department. So it was going to run in a major British newspaper, and it was Sibel Edmonds, who with corroboration from other people in the government, in the U.S. government, so the reporters had it, sourced satisfactorily, and it was to report that the U.S. was working with Ayman al-Zawahiri, up to 9/11, and that they had been working with him and collaborating with him in Baku specifically, as I recall. And that was one thing that she put. There was an article written about it in Ceasefire magazine. You've probably seen it, right? It's the one where she talks about Gladio B.
Yes,
it's one of them. And it was written by Nafiz Ahmed, who is, a pretty serious journalist. His political things have gotten strange in recent years, but he's, not someone who is disreputable or,
yeah, no, he's definitely
fabricator or anything like that. And they even wrote that article in the more an equally amazing one, if you stop and think about it, is the 2005 Vanity Fair article by David Rose, where they're talking about Sibel Edmonds' case and the fact that she's gagged, and they mention that among the things that she uncovered at the FBI was that Dennis Hastert had taken, I think it was $200,000 maybe worth of like heroin cash bribes, right? And then later she was talking about how he was sexually blackmailed as well, and that he was a pedophile, and she was writing about talking about these things.
That's well known now.
As I recall, yeah, it later got revealed. So what this tells us, these Turkish heroin networks were bribing Dennis Hastert, who was the Speaker of the House. And on the other hand, he's probably getting blackmailed as well, almost like certainly. That seems to be the only reason why he would have been in that position, because he's a troll of a character. He's not a smooth political charismatic guy at all. He seems to have been picked because he's owned by people, because he's a crazy pedophile. And they wrote about this in Vanity Fair, and she knows this based on government documents. So that's essentially smoking guns that she's encountered, and yet it doesn't matter. There's no mechanism to bring this out because it's the world of intelligence. It's why they can't prosecute Epstein. They say, oh, he belonged to intelligence. Well, ultimately, that would apply to Hastert too. And that's the kind of system that we have, where intelligence networks control the Speaker of the House, who is basically only there because he's a pedophile and totally controlled by these networks. And it connects to, it makes we understand, it helps us to understand Epstein. It helps us to understand all of these things. It's so sordid.
And I know that Sibel was also sort of in a roundabout way implicated in the Valerie Plame affair, right? Wasn't it?
I don't remember if she was or not,
Because I know that she said that
I don't remember that aspect.
there was
but
some sort of connection between, because she had tried to blow the whistle on how Turkish intelligence agents had infiltrated the FBI and high in the government, and that
Dick Armitage was one of those people involved in that case, in the
Yeah.
Valerie Plame case, and I think they ultimately pinned it on Scooter Libby, but maybe Dick Armitage as well. I can't totally remember that. They ended up having to pardon Scooter Libby, but Dick Armitage was one of the main figures in that case, and he was one of the characters that she listed in her kind of rogues gallery of people that were involved in the American Turkish lobby.
Yeah, and I know that I think there was some sort of connection between Joseph Wilson and or something to do with the Turkish lobby group that that she was saying was like really involved in and had assets in the government, that like, because there was the Valerie Plame thing was because her husband had taken out newspaper articles questioning the whole Iraq war, Yellow Cake.
Yeah, I believe it was the Niger uranium that
Yeah.
he proved that was not merely like debunkable, but that it was known to be false by the time that when the president said it.
Yeah, because he
I
was an
believe that was the
ambassador.
issue, the like so-called 16 words or whatever, where he said,
Yeah.
but we have found he has acquired a quantity of uranium from Niger or something. I don't remember what the words were, but it was something to that effect.
Yeah, I remember, and he was, he was an ambassador to, forget which African country. I don't think it was Niger. I think it was some other African country. But
Yeah,
and they knew that his wife was a CIA agent,
yeah.
and somehow I
They
don't know
outed
if they
her.
fooled, but they got Robert Novak, the late journalist, to
Yeah.
out her.
Which is fascinating also because it kind of dovetails with other things that Peter Del Scott wrote about and that I've sort of tried to pick up on, which is the CIA as, sometimes acting as kind of a realist uh, element to restrain some of these crazier aspects of, which at some point are connected to the CIA as well, as we know. So like it's very strange, like the way that this sometimes plays out, especially, in one of the main conflicts that I have seen in the CIA and the U.S. whatever national security state is over Israel traditionally, like in the 50s and 60s and so on. Even in the 80s, even with the Jonathan Pollard thing, there are elements of the CIA that tended towards the Arabist side of things because it was a more reasonable way to handle the region rather than what Israel wanted, which was to just kill everybody as much until you have a situation that's safe for like Greater Israel, to have basically hegemony over the region. But that's not a really realistic plan, and there used to be elements in the CIA that would oppose that. And it seems to me some of that was happening around '05 and around the Sibel Edmonds case, because why does Vanity Fair run that kind of article? Like, that's a magazine that's a major circulation, magazine, and why does Brzezinski come out in '07? As bad as Brzezinski is, he's coming out warning about an Iran war and saying if we do this, it's going to be a disaster. So I think that some of the things, these conflicts that we've seen, and some of the things that come out and get exposed, have to do with people in the intelligence community trying to blow the whistle in a sense, or steer policy away from the most disastrously criminal directions.
Well, maybe that's why Fuller came out. I know that he did oppose the Iraq War. Like I saw he appeared in some documentary opposing it, even though he's doing all this other stuff.
Yeah, it's
And,
so strange.
and even in relation to like the 16 words, I know that whole claim about the yellow cake uranium, that it wasn't supposed to appear in Bush's speech because it wasn't, quote unquote, verified by, there were people in the CIA that did not want that in the speech. And yet these crazy neocon foreign policy wonks like insisted on it being in there, even though it later came back to obviously to haunt them. But yeah, it does seem like sometimes there are these people that are trying to restrain the most crazy neoconservative elements.
Yeah, because if you look at what has happened to the U.S. empire, if their job is to run the U.S. empire, then they're on the brink of seeing it all go to shit. And so at some point, somebody in there must have said, "Hey, maybe this isn't wise. Maybe we should pursue some other courses." The problem was, I think, the craziest, most ruthless, most unscrupulous people win out because they all have so much dirt on each other that too often they were able to carry the day because they had whatever leverage they had in that way, and they have a lot of political leverage with campaign donations all across, the U.S., the amount of money that comes from these illicit trades and, the benefits of imperialism and the money at the command of these intelligence networks that I think are international, really. There's, I think the British and the Israelis are kind of and elements within the U.S. are kind of this neocon international, and they're the ones for this crazy jihad stuff. And eventually some people realize it's a disaster. So even Brzezinski is trying to warn about some of these things.
Well, even George,
it almost, yeah.
Even George Kennan, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but like,
yeah. He had a different take on things as he got older.
Yeah. Like in the late 90s, when the NATO expansion was just starting with, I believe it was Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary. Yeah. The architect of the Cold War was trying to sound the alarm about how this would create that Russia this would be a really big problem, and he tried to warn the public about it. Yeah. And it's
he is an interesting guy in that if you look at what his statements then, and then even some of the things he's more famous for, more well known for, like he has some obscure quotes that kind of became more popular in recent years. Like there's one on policy for East Asia over the long term, and he has this pretty Machiavellian, just sort of brutal realist kind of imperialist take on this, saying we can talk about democracy all we want, but eventually, the people aren't going to be happy about how many of the world aren't going to be so happy about how much of the world's resources the U.S. consumes and how wealthy it is compared to the rest of the world. And if we want to maintain this relationship, we're just going to have to stop talking about democracy and rights and deal in cold, hard power, right?
Yeah.
But you can look at that statement as being like, oh yeah, that's just cold imperialism. Or if you stop and think about his position in that bureaucracy, he could be essentially trying to highlight aspects of the policy that need to be taken into account, that by pursuing policies this way, this is eventually where it's going to lead. And that is kind of where it's headed. And it shows an empire that's really weak and kind of on the verge of perhaps receding or being transcended. I'm hoping there's not some dramatic collapse here, but we have pursued things in a unipolar, tried to basically rule the world as much of it as we could. And now it's coming apart, and you can see more of these terrible things that are below the surface that have been kept hidden for a while. And so work like what you're doing, what I've tried to do, hopefully, as people say, how did it possibly get this bad? We can provide some explanations and say, like, this is what we were doing all the time. This is the kind of regime that we really have. These are the things that they do. This is what the hot people that occupy the highest positions of power have been doing in the name of the American people, which is, it's so wild that you don't even know where to begin with it when you start talking to people if they're not familiar with it.
I think a lot of what you're saying almost kind of currently explains what appears to be like the seeming division within not like just the ruling class, but like the foreign policy elite as to what direction the U.S. should take as far as, its hegemony being in decline, where you have, like supposedly the person that uh, had Trump's ear or was like convincing him to, at least on the campaign trail, and even some of the stuff that's going on now, like with, for example, the Ukraine negotiations, that Henry Kissinger was one of the people that convinced Trump to like sort of embrace, like at least rhetorically, like a kind of rapprochement or détente with Russia.
Yeah.
Uh,
Kissinger was not a neocon. He was not an ultra Zionist unipolar lunatic. He was a Rockefeller realist, basically.
yeah, exactly. And I think that sort of explains why there's people who seemingly some have identified China as the greater threat to U.S. full spectrum dominance, and then there are others who want to take on Russia and China at the same time. And then there are, the people who just really seemingly identify Russia as the primary threat. I mean, it's
And there's the people that want Iran. I mean, the Zionist crowd is fixated on Iran, and that's it. The American militarist, super imperialist, mobbed up military industrial complex aspect of the unipolar neocon project, and then there's the fanatical Zionist one. And the crazy thing is, the US doesn't have a way to really strategically defeat Russia, China, or Iran. And the fact that they have tried to orchestrate some way of doing any of those things is what's been, it's leading them to ruin.
yeah, it's certainly, I mean, like, I know that the recent strike that, I mean, supposedly Mike Waltz was fired because he wanted
To attack Iran.
yeah, and then
This is a good sign.
I
I mean,
certainly
I
hope so. I certainly hope cooler heads prevail, because the whole thing with Trump is that he's supposed to be worse on Israel, right? I mean, he's supposed to be giving them the
he's
go.
he's terrible absolutely. I mean, he's got a lot of blood on his hands. It's his genocide now too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just don't know. It's just such mixed signals when you see, like, there was supposed like that Israel, these reports, if they're true, that Israel wanted to attack Iran and that Trump shot it down. I mean, it seems like there's multiple competing interests in that administration.
I think enough people have told Trump that if he attacks Iran, it is in all likelihood a disaster for the U.S. and could potentially lead to a nuclear war. Because if Russia, I mean, my one interpretation I've seen or explanation is that they don't have a formal military treaty, but that if Iran is attacked in a way that violates the UN charter, then Russia would intervene on its behalf, would act to protect
Potentially
it.
China too. I mean, China has a 25-year economic cooperation agreement with
Yeah,
them, and the also, like, not just a nuclear war, but it could also potentially crash the global economy,
yeah,
because the
yeah.
Strait of Hormuz, and then you also have this whole thing
Then you,
going on with China and the trade war and the tariffs. I mean, this is all a lot on Trump's plate, and I don't know how.
that's why he's talking about Greenland and Panama. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, I can't. I'm gonna look. I think that because they can't get the war in Ukraine stopped, because they can't really agree to the reality on the battlefield and the fact that Russia is really in a position to dictate terms, then the war is going on further, and the Ukrainian position is just deteriorating further. That is going to be a bigger disaster. And everything that the U.S. has tried to achieve, they've worked in the opposite direction. They have strengthened Russia, they've weakened themselves, and they've weakened NATO. Uh, when what everything they were doing was trying to achieve the opposite, and it is amazing to see.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't seem to be something that can be reversed without something unforeseen happening that I just don't see in the cards. I think that they're going to be transcended by other countries and another system. China's managed capital, the administrative state in China, which has managed a market economy
Mm-hmm.
in a way as such as to make sure that economic activity not merely produces a set of oligarchs, but lifts a whole lot of people out of poverty and builds infrastructure to fuel an even bigger takeoff in the future. That seems to be spreading into more of the heartland of China and not just on the coastal cities anymore. It's amazing what they are doing, and that they will, if the U.S. doesn't start a war or some sort of crazy economic crisis to really derail things, it's just going to continue that way. And it really is. It's interesting to think of the effect COVID had in kind of slowing that down for like a minute, but like it doesn't last forever, and China is just going to transcend the U.S. and the U.S. is going to look like a crazy nation of militarists shredding babies, running jihad heroin operations around the world, trying to control the
We
world that
already
way.
do.
I mean, we just look like a bunch of gangsters, and the more that people realize that, wow, they look like a bunch of gangsters, and we don't even know the half of it.
Hmm.
This is how I think the U.S. empire is going to collapse. The U.S. and it's what it really means is the end of white European people being the dominant actors in world history.
Yeah.
And it's we. I don't want to say we, but like I am a light skinned person. Like I'm 1/16 Native American, but and hillbilly, which from West Virginia, my background, and for a while,
I hear a little
there's a
thing.
whole literature on those not exactly being white people, but let's be real, I am a white person, but I'm not associated with this project. Like that's just
Yeah.
where I think we need to be like, whiteness itself and this whole thing of like the West being the good guys and democracy and capitalism is it's all just bullshit for an organized crime syndicate. Western civilization has become an organized crime syndicate.
Yeah. That was pretty brilliant what you all laid out there. Yeah, I too foresee the American empire collapsing. I don't think there's anybody that can deny that at this point. Um, and yeah, I think that sort of explains why within the establishment there are these divisions. Uh, and going back even further, like into the particularities of how to conduct and manage empire as the stewards of it. Where you have the arch neocons and the ones that are totally beholden to the Zionist project, and then you have the realist doctrine of statecraft. Uh, you know, which it's interesting because Brzezinski was supposed to be a realist too. He was not a neoconservative, but yet when the Second Chechen War began, and he founded not just the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya, but also joined the Jamestown Foundation, which had been originally set up by Bill Casey, actually to help Soviet defectors during the Cold War. It then shifted to something that targeting the Russian Federation. When Brzezinski joined that around that time, I mean, the Jamestown Foundation and the ACPC, even though Brzezinski was a realist, were supposed to be. I mean, the roster, like I said, is just full of neocons, and a lot of these, uh, totally. I mean, and many of them even from the most ultra Zionist elements, like Michael Ledeen was one of them,
Yeah.
who was part of Iran Contra, and he had been involved in all kinds of crazy stuff, like even like
Yeah, super Zionist connected to all of these networks of
like he
deep
had been involved like.
clandestine criminality.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael Ledeen had even been involved, I believed, in that scandal during the Carter administration that like Jimmy Carter's brother was like taking money from Libya or
I think
like
he was involved in some sort of Portugal Rhodesia scandal too, or something like that. He was involved in all sorts of. He comes up in weird places. Maybe
yeah,
in
I
the
know.
'70s, there's something about him with the like, because I think wasn't Rhodesia like a Portuguese colony? Uh,
Well, I know it was it was like South Africa. It was you
Yeah, I
know
know it was, but I think I believe it may have had a Portuguese population, and it may have been one of the last like kind of colonies left over in that way. Maybe its collapse had to do with the collapse of a fascist system in Portugal too. So, but
right.
if memory serves, Ladine may have been involved in something like that. But set that all that aside, he's a guy who has been involved in these sort of parafascist transnational networks tied especially to U.S. and Israel kind of neocon criminality.
Yeah. Yeah, I know he was involved like in scandals. Like I know one of them was that after there was that assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II by, I mentioned it in my article actually because I talk about how the Grey
Grey
Wolves
Wolves, yeah.
were supposedly part of Gladio B that Sibyl Edmonds blew the whistle on. Well, supposedly Michael Ledeen like put out disinformation because he was connected or was an asset of like Italian intelligence who were part of obviously Operation Gladio. But he basically put it out that the Grey Wolves member that tried to kill the Pope was like acting under orders from the KGB.
Oh yeah. That'd be
Just
exactly what he
crazy
would say.
talk. Why
Yeah.
would a fascist paramilitary guy be working with communists? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But nevertheless, he's a nutter, and now apparently he's like, he's also the irony that he's like a huge Islamophobe, and yet, he's on the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya, supporting the most radical.
Well, I mean, that says it all, doesn't it? I mean, if
Yeah.
you've got like Western U.S., Israeli, Gulf state, cutouts, and Turkey propping up the jihadis in Syria now, or if just to think about Israel propping up Hamas, basically trying to gin them up so that they will essentially replace the PLO, because the PLO is more sympathetic. You don't want a sympathetic adversary. You don't want to negotiate. You want, bad guys that you can easily caricature and then justify killing. So this is the way that they've operated. Max, we've gone on over time even, but it was good to talk to you because it was great to discuss your article and all the things in there. And I think it's always good to be able to rehash some of this history because a lot of people don't know it and they're not going to find it too many places. So where can people read your work?
Well, it's currently syndicated in Covert Action magazine, and hopefully will continue to be. And I just started a podcast called Captive Minds, which we have a YouTube channel. It's Captive Minds X. And yeah, that's a new project that I just started.
You have a co-host, right?
Yeah, her name is Shayna Batterson. She's a very young but really precocious writer. I mean, just great. We had actually been on another podcast together, and then we left that podcast over creative differences and decided to just start doing our own thing. But my work is syndicated in CAM, and there's going to be a part 2, like I said, to this Chechnya article, and I've got a lot of other things in the works. It's funny you were talking about the Franklin scandal. One of the things I have in the works is an article on the CIA and cults, and the Franklin scandal definitely plays into that. And you gave me kind of like a new little angle to look at that from as well. So, I've got a lot of stuff in the works, but people can read me in CAM.
All right. Yeah, I'll put links to the Covert Action magazine article that we discussed today and to your YouTube or your podcast YouTube channel.
I'll send you
absolutely.
Thank you so much for having me on, Aaron. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for doing the work that you're doing, and I hope that more people continue to write and read this sort of work because it's going to help us to understand the nature of this system that is collapsing and why it is collapsing, because I think it's a crucial part to understand. It's basically run by gangsters, and we've got to decide that we're going to accept that forever. So this is what we're dealing with. But again, thanks so much, and I'll talk to you later.
Thank you, Aaron. Take care.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. Please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to this American Exception channel. Check out the show notes for links to Max Parry's article and to his podcast, Captive Minds. It's good that Max Parry is out there working on the real story of the Chechen wars. We need as many diligent people as we can muster to illuminate the darkness so that we can better understand what is happening on the devil's chessboard.